Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
The first thing you should know is that I did not come to Grandma Ruth's birthday to start a fight or to keep score like a bored referee at a church league game. I came because I told myself that after years of uneven holidays and lopsided phone calls and a very creative family tradition of pretending certain memories never happened, I could handle one more afternoon of sheet cake, Costco flowers, and everyone in coordinated pastels pretending we are a magazine ad for Midwestern Grace, and I even wore the soft blue dress that my mother, Linda, once called agreeable because I thought being agreeable might be the only safe hobby left for me in this clan. The banquet room at the country club had that freezing air that turns your arms into gooseflesh no matter how warm it is outside, and Aunt Karen, who runs family events the way a mall manager runs Black Friday, was already directing people into their assigned seats with a smile so bright it felt like stage lighting, and I caught my reflection in the gold-framed mirror near the bar and told myself, out loud but under my breath, that I would make it through cake and speeches and the slideshow, without commenting on the photos mysteriously missing a certain person during certain years when I was apparently exiled to the witness protection program of family memory. And I would clap for the toasts and laugh at the jokes and say thank you when the time came for the gift bags that Karen had spent 2 months bragging about on Facebook, carefully hinting that everything inside was personalized and deeply meaningful. Grandma Ruth looked good, better than I expected, the kind of good that comes from a lifetime of starch and prayer and keeping other people's secrets. She wore pearls that had belonged to her mother, and she squeezed my hand longer than she squeezed anyone else's. Not because I am the favorite, but because she knows I look directly at things, and if you are 80 and tired of pretending there are no elephants in the dining room, you might enjoy a granddaughter who calls the elephants by their first names. There was chicken with a lemon glaze and a salad with too many walnuts and speeches that sounded like curated museum placards, and I let them wash over me like elevator music. And when the waiters cleared the plates, Aunt Karen clapped her hands like a kindergarten teacher, and the cousins lined up at a long table where white bags with satin handles waited in neat rows, each with a name tag in that looping script she paid a calligrapher for. Because nothing in Karen's world is real unless it looks good in a photo. Names were called with the cadence of a raffle, and people cheered, and tissue paper rustled, and I watched my cousin Megan pull out a silver locket engraved with a date only the two of us would recognize, and I watched my older brother Luke, who once borrowed money from me and forgot to return it, lift out a monogrammed leather journal as if he had invented literacy, and I made a silent bet with myself that my bag, when it arrived, would contain a scented candle labeled Perspective, and I almost laughed at my own joke because sometimes humor is the only umbrella I have. Karen reached for another bag, paused theatrically as if consulting a teleprompter, and then called a few more names, and the stack of bags dwindled until the white tablecloth showed through, and a waiter carried away the cardboard box that had held the extras. And my mother's hands twisted the napkin into a sad little rope while she stared at her lap like it might offer instructions, and I kept my face still in the way that women learn early, the way you tighten every muscle under the skin, until your expression says nothing and everything at once, and when the last bag was given and the applause swelled and died, I realized without needing anyone to say it that in this carefully scripted matinee about love and legacy there was no prop with my name on it. I felt the heat crawl up my neck the way a blush does when a stranger waves and you wave back and realize it was for someone behind you. I waited 3 beats, because 3 feels polite, then I stood, not abruptly, just decisively. Slid my chair in with the kind of care that makes the wood whisper instead of scrape, and walked toward the mirror near the bar because mirrors tell the truth even when relatives do not, and in the glass I saw the room at my back, balloons, pearls, people, and my own face calm enough to make a poker player jealous, and I lifted my phone and framed the shot so the bags glowed behind me like a tiny boutique of belonging, and I took the selfie without a single tremor in my hands. In the hallway outside the banquet room the carpet smelled like citrus cleaner and old secrets, and I leaned against the wall and typed one sentence that felt like a pin pulled clean from a grenade, 80 years of love, and some of us are still standing outside the door. And I added the photo, unchecked the family group from the restricted audience because today was not for hiding, hit post, and watched the little spinning will complete its quiet revolution like a clock finally telling the right time. Revenge, in my experience, does not always arrive with noise and confetti. Sometimes it is a single line delivered with the steadiness of a surgeon's hand. And as I slipped my purse strap over my shoulder and pushed open the heavy glass door to the parking lot where the summer heat folded around me like a blanket nobody offered inside, my phone buzzed once with a notification, then again, the rhythm quickening like a heartbeat finding a reason, and I smiled without showing teeth. Because I did not have to raise my voice or flip a table, I only had to hold up a mirror, and as the screen lit with names I recognized and names I had not seen in years, I let the door close behind me and walked toward my car while somewhere inside that refrigerated room, Aunt Karen's carefully staged afternoon began to tilt. By the time I reached my car, the notifications had multiplied like summer gnats around a porch light, and because I have learned that true control is rarely loud, I buckled in, rolled the windows just enough to let out the refrigeration I had been braced inside, and opened the post to watch it gather gravity in front of me, little blue thumbs and surprised faces piling up under the single sentence with a neatness Aunt Karen usually reserved for centerpieces, while comments began to braid themselves into a rope that pulled old acquaintances, former church ladies, and the occasional high school friend who still lives 3 miles from the country club into a conversation that was not actually about a selfie or a bag of curated trinkets, but about the sort of family arithmetic that quietly subtracts the same person for years and then acts bewildered when the math shows a remainder. I did not write back to the first wave of comments because performing outrage rarely changes anything, and because the first responders were the predictable mix of kind people offering neutral words about misunderstandings, overly invested cousins using exclamation points like confetti cannons, and one of Karen's friends from the neighborhood association who once tried to sell me essential oils and now wanted to sell me perspective. So I simply adjusted the privacy setting from friends to friends of friends, tagged the location with the bland accuracy of a weather report, and let the oxygen into the room, which, as it turns out, is a marvelous way to discover who has been waiting for the chance to tell the truth without being the first one to speak. The family group chat began to ping like a slot machine on a good night, and because I am not a saint, I opened it, and there, right on schedule, Karen had posted a long paragraph about how much work goes into planning an inclusive celebration, followed by a carefully cropped photo of Grandma Ruth cutting the cake, followed by a line that would have been funny if it were not so sincerely meant, something about no one being intentionally excluded, which read like a weatherproof disclaimer on a product that had already melted, and while a few of the reliable cousins replied with heart stickers and proud aunt vibes, my mother sent a single bubble that said, "Let's talk later," without punctuation, which in my family is basically a threat dressed as etiquette. Karen called while I was still staring at that bubble, her name blooming across my screen with the kind of cheerful ringtone I picked back when I believed neutrality could be engineered, and I let it ring once to steady my voice, then answered with a hello that could have been a handshake or a warning depending on how you held it, and she launched into a tirade about optics and dignity and Grandma's feelings, her words tumbling over themselves the way a person's do when the performance has fallen off the stage and the audience is suddenly seeing the plywood and tape, and I listened without interrupting because you learn a lot when people think you are still the quiet one, and when she finally arrived at the destination we both knew was coming, deleted. "Emma, it is not fair," I told her, in one long, careful sentence, that I would not be deleting anything because the post was true and because the world did not end when a truth was spoken out loud, and also because if the problem was public embarrassment, perhaps the solution would be to stop manufacturing situations that embarrass people. She tried politeness next, the kind that comes laced with sugar and tranquilizer, promising another bag, an oversight corrected, an extra ribbon even. And I said I was not 5 and did not need a consolation prize for understanding my place in the seating chart, then thanked her for the invitation to rewrite the afternoon, but declined on account of preferring reality to revision, and when she started crying, I could hear the damp flutter in her breath even as she denied it. I asked, as gently as I could manage, whether she was crying because Grandma was hurt or because the picture-perfect day had grown a crack she could not sandpaper smooth, at which point she hung up, which frankly felt like a mercy for both of us. I made one edit to the post, not to inflame but to redirect, adding a line that read, "Donated the cost of one gift bag to the senior center in Grandma Ruth's name this afternoon, because love is better when it passes around the room." And I attached a screenshot of the receipt from the drive-through donation page with my name unobscured, which was a small, tidy form of revenge that tasted like cool water after a long, rehearsed drought, since it said, without shouting, that I did not need wet. They withheld in order to give something that mattered, and it also put a quiet question in every reader's mind about what, exactly, the organizers had valued. More comments slid under the photo, some from people I barely know telling stories about being the one who had to smile through 100 small exclusions at school recitals and office potlucks, and one from Mrs. Hargrove, our old next-door neighbor with the rosebushes, who wrote that lists in our family had always been edited at the last minute, which made my scalp prickle because she is not the type to stir anything without a recipe. And then my phone hummed with a private message request. From Megan, my cousin with the silver locket, who said she was sorry and that there was something I needed to see. And her typing bubble appeared and disappeared twice like a nervous firefly before she finally sent a screenshot of another group I had never been invited to, a thread with a name so bland it could pass as wallpaper, where I was discussed like a line item and where a single sentence, half cut off at the edge of her capture, read, "She would not appreciate it anyway, and besides the fund," and then it trailed into pixels, which is the precise moment I realized the party might have merely been the appetizer, and that the main course, the one everyone had been chewing in secret for years, was finally on its way to my table. Megan's message arrived in fragments, a hesitant confession stretched over several minutes, each new screenshot landing like a pebble dropped into water that had been too still for too long. And with every ripple I began to see just how meticulously my family had constructed its version of truth, layering gossip and half-facts until the original shape of me had disappeared beneath the polite sediment of their storytelling. She wrote that the group chat had started a few years ago when Aunt Karen decided that not everyone needed to be involved in planning family events, and I could almost hear her exact tone in that phrase, gentle dictatorship disguised as organization. While Megan admitted that sometimes they discussed finances and who contributed what, which might have sounded harmless if one of the screenshots hadn't included a thread about the college fund that went nowhere, my name mentioned once, surrounded by laughing reactions. It took me several long minutes to make sense of it, scrolling back and forth through the screenshots as if the act of rereading might change the meaning, but the words remained steady and cruel in their normalcy, suggesting that I didn't need help with tuition because I chose art instead of something practical, and that Grandma did her part already when she helped pay for my brother's first apartment, as though family obligation were a buffet where you fill one plate and never return. I remembered being 18, sitting at the kitchen table with my acceptance letter and my mother saying the money wasn't there, that things were tight, and I had nodded because that's what you do when you're raised to be grateful for what you get, not resentful for what you don't. Now, reading those words written years later by people who wore matching sweaters every Christmas, I felt something colder than anger, clarity, maybe, or the kind of stillness that follows a sudden storm. Megan's final message said, "There's more, but you need to hear it from your mom," and I stared at the screen until it dimmed itself, thinking about all the times my mother had said she hated drama, that silence keeps the peace, and realizing that maybe peace, in her language, had always meant my compliance. When I finally called her, she answered with a voice already prepared for battle, the kind of soft exhaustion that parents wear like armor when they've been warned something uncomfortable is coming. I didn't ask if she'd seen the post because I knew she had. Her first sentence was, "You've made things very hard for everyone, Emma," which carried the same emotional weight as a stranger saying the weather was unpredictable. I told her about the screenshots, about the messages discussing funds that were supposedly gone before I ever needed them, and she sighed the way someone does when they realize a lock has rusted shut and the key has long been lost. "Karen handled all that," she said finally, the words tumbling out too quickly, as if speed could disguise intent, and I felt a strange kind of pity then, because my mother has always been a woman built on compromises, the sort who smooths over every crack until her own reflection disappears into the surface. She explained that when my grandfather died there had been a disagreement about the will, that certain accounts were merged or redirected, that Karen had been more responsible with money, and that Grandma didn't want conflict. Each phrase was a cushion, soft enough to land on but incapable of supporting any real weight, and by the end of the call my mother was crying, insisting she never meant to hurt me, that she thought I had made peace with how things turned out. I did not yell or accuse her of anything because shouting felt like giving the story back to them, letting them decide what kind of daughter I was supposed to be, so I simply said, "I understand," and in that moment I truly did. I understood that every silence, every dismissal, every unspoken apology had been a choice made to preserve comfort, not truth. When I hung up, the sky outside my window had shifted into that bruised shade between daylight and evening, and I realized how much time had passed since I'd left the party. The notifications on my phone had slowed, but not stopped. People were still commenting, still messaging, the story already living its own life beyond my control. I opened the post one last time and reread my caption, and it struck me that I had never actually mentioned the gift bags or the family by name. That all of this chaos had been built on an assumption everyone recognized because it fit too neatly into the shape of their guilt. That night I drafted another post, not an apology, but something quieter, written in the tone of someone who has finally stopped apologizing for existing. I wrote that love without honesty eventually turns into debt, that silence is not the same as peace, and that sometimes you have to lose a family gathering to find your place in the story. I didn't tag anyone or add a photo. The words stood on their own, tall and unadorned. Within an hour, distant relatives I barely remembered began leaving comments, small, nervous things like "beautifully said" and "so true." And one private message from a cousin in another state who admitted that Karen had done something similar with their inheritance years ago, but everyone agreed to drop it. When I went to bed, I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just hollow in the clean way a wound feels after it's been washed. Somewhere inside me, a plan was beginning to take shape, not for destruction but for revelation, because I understood now that revenge, to be worth anything, must illuminate rather than merely wound. And as I closed my eyes, I imagined Aunt Karen seeing those same screenshots, her neat world of color-coded folders and perfect photographs beginning to tilt, while the single question she never wanted asked, "What exactly happened to that fund?" finally started echoing through the hallways of her curated peace. By morning, the digital noise had settled into that deceptive quiet that comes after a storm, when the wind stops, but every branch still trembles from what it endured, and as I made coffee and watched the sun crawl reluctantly across the kitchen tiles, I could feel the world rearranging itself around what had already been said. The post had taken on a strange half-life of its own. It no longer belonged to me but to the interpretation of others, and through their speculation the truth began to spread further than I ever planned, each share a small act of rebellion disguised as empathy. I hadn't slept much, not because I was guilty but because my mind kept replaying fragments of my mother's voice and the way her words twisted like ribbons around things she would never admit, until the sound of the kettle became the only honest noise left in the room. It was Megan who called first that morning, her tone uneasy, as if she were already regretting the role she had played by sending those screenshots, and she told me in a rush that Aunt Karen was in pieces, that she had driven to Grandma Ruth's house late at night and stayed there, crying in the kitchen until Grandma told her to go home. The image of Karen sobbing in that same kitchen where every family rule had been drafted didn't move me to pity so much as curiosity, because I had seen her orchestrate heartbreak before and knew that her tears were often a form of control, a way to soften the ground before she planted another narrative. Megan said the extended family chat had split into factions, half insisting that I had gone too far and half quietly acknowledging that it was about time someone did, and even though she tried to make it sound like gossip, I could hear the tremor beneath her words, the kind of fear that comes from realizing an entire family's mythology might be collapsing. I went online only once that morning, not to read the comments, but to write something new, a short post shaped like a mirror rather than a sword. I wrote that forgiveness is not the same as pretending, that truth does not require permission to exist, and that sometimes love must be stripped of sentiment to survive. It was the kind of message that could be read as either spiritual reflection or calculated provocation, depending on who was reading it, and that ambiguity was exactly what I wanted. The responses were immediate, people sharing quotes about boundaries and healing, others asking in private messages if I was all right, and within an hour the original party photo was circulating again, repurposed by strangers as a cautionary tale about being the excluded one. I did not correct them, because every retelling only strengthened the echo. Around noon my mother showed up at my door without warning, her face pale and tight in a way I hadn't seen since my father's funeral, and before she even sat down she said, "You need to stop, Emma. You're hurting people." There was no accusation in her voice, only the exhaustion of someone who has spent her entire life balancing on the edge of someone else's approval. She said Grandma was upset, that Karen hadn't stopped calling, and that the neighbors were talking, as if the true tragedy was not what had been hidden, but that the curtains had been pulled back. I listened without interrupting, and when she paused to breathe, I asked whether she had ever wondered why the truth always seemed to wound the person who exposed it more than the one who created it. She looked at me for a long time before answering, and the sadness in her eyes was almost unbearable. "Because comfort," she said finally, "is easier to love than honesty." That single sentence explained more than any confession could have, and as she sat there with her hands clasped in her lap like a penitent child, I realized that her entire life had been one long negotiation with silence, a habit so ingrained that she couldn't tell the difference between peace and paralysis. She tried to explain that Grandma had been protecting me in her own way, that there were family matters too complicated for my generation to understand, but the words dissolved before they could find footing. I told her I didn't need protection, I needed accountability, but she looked away as if I'd spoken in another language. When she finally left, she hugged me the way people do when they suspect it might be the last time they are allowed to do it without asking. Later that afternoon, I received a text from an unknown number that began with, "You've made a mess that can't be cleaned," and though it wasn't signed, I didn't need to ask who had sent it. I stared at the words until the meaning lost its shape and became nothing more than pixels of desperation. I did not reply, not because I wanted the last word, but because silence now carried a sharper edge than anything I could write. Instead, I went back to the post and edited it one last time, adding a single line at the end. "Some debts are emotional, some are generational. Either way, they come due." Within hours, I started receiving private messages from old family friends, people who remembered details I'd never heard, small remarks about the inheritance dispute, about Karen's control over family finances, about the quiet argument that had driven my father away from Sunday dinners years ago. Each message was a thread, and together they began to weave a pattern so intricate it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. And while I read them, I realized that what had started as a quiet protest against being left out of a party had become a reckoning far older and wider than any of us. That night, as rain began to fall against the windows, I felt the peculiar calm that comes when the truth has gathered enough momentum to travel without you. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, and somewhere inside that stillness I understood that I no longer needed to expose anyone. The weight of their own guilt was already doing the work. Yet, even in that calm, there was an ache I couldn't ignore, a small grief for the family I had tried to love within the limits they allowed. I knew the story wasn't over, that there was one final truth still hiding in the shadows, and that when it emerged, no one, including me, would leave untouched. 2 hours after the last edit, when the sky had the color of cooled ash and the rain stitched the street into a single gray ribbon, my phone began to vibrate with the stubborn insistence of a thought that refuses to be ignored. And when I answered without checking the caller ID, I heard first the breath, thin and ragged like someone running in place, and then my aunt's voice collapsing through my speaker. Not the stage-managed cheerfulness she wears like a uniform, but a raw, unpainted sound that made the hairs on my arms rise even before the words found me, because she said my name the way a person says the name of a witness, and then launched into a tangle of sentences about damage and betrayal, and how I had broken something that had been carefully maintained. Even as I understood that her grief was less about what I had done and more about the unraveling of an arrangement she believed could outlive truth as long as the curtains stayed closed. She tried to regain her footing by using family as both shield and sword. Grandma is fragile, your mother is not well, the neighbors are unkind, and then her voice pitched higher when she realized I was not interrupting with apologies or concessions. At which point she demanded I remove the posts and promise to stop suggesting things you don't understand, and I told her, very calmly and in a single sentence that left no place to hide, that the problem was not my suggestion but her certainty. And that certainty built on secrecy is simply fear with good lighting. Silence pooled between us, a long unbroken stretch where I heard her swallow, and then the smallest sound, like a chair leg scraping tile far away, and when she spoke again the bravado had drained out of her. She said Grandma wanted to talk. That Grandma had asked for me after seeing the noise, and that I should come now before she changed her mind, and something in me answered before I did, because I was already grabbing my keys and moving toward the door while telling her I would be there in 20 minutes, thinking how strange it is that your feet can carry you into rooms your heart has spent years avoiding, and how quickly the body recognizes the geography of old grief. The house smelled the way it always does, like lemon oil and starch and something faintly sweet, and Grandma sat at the kitchen table wearing the cardigan she reserves for serious conversations, a thick knit that looks like armor on a small woman. And she did not reach for my hand or kiss my cheek, she just looked at me for a long time without blinking and then told Aunt Karen to leave us, using a tone I have heard only a few times in my life, a tone with the authority of a judge who has already read the file. She did not circle the subject or ask me to soften anything. She said there had been 2 accounts years ago, one that everyone knew about and one that few remembered because remembering would have made certain choices impossible. And that after my grandfather died the papers shifted the way papers tend to do when the person who kept track of them is no longer around to remind signatures what they mean. And that my aunt handled the consolidation with an efficiency that made it easy not to ask questions, and that my mother agreed, not because she wanted to deprive me, but because she thought avoiding a fight might save what was left of the family's dignity. Then she told me there was a letter in the desk with my name on it, one she had written and rewritten for years and never sent, because every version apologized for the wrong things. And while she spoke, I understood with a clarity that made me both grateful and furious that the people who taught me to love also taught me to accept the kind of loss that can be passed off as fate if you never look directly at it. When she finished, she did something I had not expected. She slid a small envelope across the table, the sort they tuck cash inside for birthdays, and inside was not money, but a single page copied from a lawyer's file with 2 signatures and 1 date. A page that would make a mess of reputation if it ever wanted to, and she told me that she had asked Karen about it the night before and that Karen had cried and said it was complicated, and that she had believed her because believing felt like an old habit she did not know how to break, and then she looked at me with the impatience of someone who has no time left for lies and asked what I wanted to do. I thought of vengeance the way novels teach it, loud and satisfying and wrapped with a bow, and then I thought of the long week line of silence that had traveled through this family like an heirloom no one wanted to claim, and I heard my own voice respond that I did not want blood, that I wanted the truth to exist in daylight and for the accounting to be public even if the punishment was private, and that I wanted my mother to stop mistaking my composure for forgiveness. The revenge I chose was small and surgical, a neat incision rather than a spectacle. I drafted a final post that did not name names or detail sums or attach the page. A post that simply thanked everyone for their messages and said that the situation was being handled within the family and that sometimes accountability looks like people sitting across a table with documents between them instead of love. And I wrote that I would be making a scholarship donation in Grandpa's name for a student who chooses art and refuses to apologize for it, and I tagged the local foundation so anyone who wanted to help could help without needing to know why they were moved to do it. And I hit publish while Karen stood in the doorway with her mascara like waterlines, and my mother on the porch staring at her hands. Later, when I left the house, my aunt called again, crying the way she had at the beginning, promising to make things right and asking how to fix what she called a misunderstanding, and I told her that misunderstandings die when the truth is spoken clearly in the presence of everyone it affects, and that we could set a time for that to happen, and she cried harder, but she did not say no. I would like to tell you that we met the next day and signatures changed hands and years collapsed into apology, but the real ending is quieter and more complicated. The meeting is scheduled, the envelope is back in Grandma's desk. My mother calls every evening with halting weather reports on Karen's mood, the posts remain, and the scholarship application link keeps collecting small donations from strangers who recognize themselves in a blurry photo of a woman holding a mirror to a room that forgot her name. At night, when the house is still and my phone rests face down on the table, I think about the sentence I wrote the day I walked out and how it continues to do its work without me, and I wonder whether I engineered all of this or simply stopped cooperating with a lie. And that uncertainty feels like the only honest place to leave things, because maybe there are families you fix and families you outgrow, and maybe the cleverest revenge is not the confession wrung from a guilty mouth, but the quiet realignment of a life that no longer waits to be invited to the table.